Hi, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. This podcast of the People's Pharmacy is brought to you by Squatty Potty Toilet Stools. They create healthy toilet posture for fast, easy elimination. Learn more about toilet posture and health at squattypotty.com. That's SQUATTYPOTTY.com.
Generic drugs account for more than 80% of all prescriptions filled in the U.S. What are the pros and cons of unbranding modern medicine? This is the People's Pharmacy with Terry and Joe Graydon.
Chances are good that at least one of your prescriptions has been filled with a generic formulation. The FDA says such products are identical to their brand name counterparts, but problems with foreign manufacturers raise questions about quality.
Generic drugs have been promoted as a great way to save money on healthcare, but lately the prices of some generic drugs have soared. The price tag on the antibiotic doxycycline increased 5,000% since 2012. What's going on?
Coming up on the People's Pharmacy, your calls and questions about generic drugs.
First, this news.
In the People's Pharmacy Health Headlines, the flu season has begun early this year, and it could be bad. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention prepare a map of flu prevalence each week. For last week, it showed widespread infections in several states, including Illinois, Louisiana, Maryland, North Carolina, and Florida. All states are reporting some influenza activity, including regional or local outbreaks. Holiday travel could spread flu viruses even further and faster. One of the circulating strains is type A influenza H3N2. It's causing severe illness, and it's expected to be responsible for a substantial number of deaths this year.
Public health officials are urging everyone to get their flu shots this year, but they admit that the H3N2 virus has mutated. That means the vaccine will offer significantly less protection. Every year, epidemiologists have to guess months in advance which strains will be circulating so the vaccinations can be prepared. But viruses don't always cooperate, and this year, the H3N2 that now dominates is not a good match for the strain included in the shot. The CDC is now encouraging doctors to prescribe antiviral drugs like Tamiflu and Relenza when people come down with influenza. These drugs work best, however, when taken within the first day or two of symptoms.
Drinking from rigid, clear plastic bottles or from cans raises urinary levels of bisphenol A. This compound, known as BPA, has been identified as an endocrine disruptor. Now, research from Korea indicates that it can also raise blood pressure. The investigators recruited 60 subjects who drank soy milk either from cans lined with BPA-containing plastic or from glass bottles. In the crossover design, each subject served as his or her own control. Consuming soy milk from cans raised urinary levels of BPA 16-fold. As BPA increased, systolic blood pressure readings also rose. The mean blood pressure increase was 5 millimeters. That may not sound like much, but at a public health level, it is important. That's about how much most antihypertensive drugs lower systolic pressure. The American Chemistry Council, an industry trade group, objects to the study and considers the findings overstated. Nonetheless, it may be wise for people who are susceptible to high blood pressure to reduce their exposure to BPA by avoiding beverages and foods packaged in cans.
Doctors often worry about their chronic pain patients becoming addicted to narcotics. That may explain the popularity of a pain reliever perceived as non-addictive. Tramadol is characterized as a weak opioid analgesic that can be taken without fear of dependency. That's why it's prescribed so widely. Tramadol may not be quite as safe as physicians think, however. A new report in JAMA Internal Medicine shows that tramadol is associated with serious hypoglycemia, blood sugar so low that the patient needs to be hospitalized. This is a rare complication, but it can be extremely serious or even fatal. The researcher found this side effect was about 3 times more common among people taking tramadol than among those on codeine. The elderly and those with diabetes are at particular risk, and doctors may need to monitor them more closely for the first several months after starting them on tramadol.
Research on the anesthetic ketamine has shown that it can sometimes produce a quick but not long-lasting remission from otherwise intractable depression. Scientists wondered whether nitrous oxide, the so-called laughing gas sometimes used as a dental anesthetic, could produce similar benefits. They compared the effects of nitrous oxide inhalation to placebo inhalation among 20 volunteers whose depression had not responded to other treatments. The day after nitrous oxide, 3 people said their depression had lifted completely, and 7 others said they felt significantly better. An additional 7 had mild symptom improvement. This pilot study is too small to determine whether laughing gas could become a treatment of last resort for people whose depression does not yield to other treatments, but it certainly suggests an interesting path for future research. And that's the health news from the People's Pharmacy this week.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon. I'm a pharmacologist.
And I'm Terry Graydon. I'm a medical anthropologist. Our topic today is generic drugs. If you're taking medications, it's likely that at least one of them is a generic. 12 years ago, generic drugs represented 42% of all prescriptions dispensed. Today, that number has doubled to 84%. We save over $200 billion a year thanks to generic medicines. But are they identical to their brand name counterparts?
To help us understand the complex world of generic medications, we turn to Dr. Jeremy Greene. He's Associate Professor of Medicine and the History of Medicine and the Elizabeth Trida and A. McGee Harvey Chair in the History of Medicine at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. He's the author of Prescribing by Numbers, Drugs and the Definition of Disease, and co-editor of Prescribed, Writing, Filling, Using, and Abusing the Prescription in Modern Medicine, both published by Johns Hopkins University Press. Dr. Greene's most recent book is Generic, The Unbranding of Modern Medicine. Welcome to the People's Pharmacy, Dr. Greene.
Thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be here today.
Dr. Greene, what do we mean by generic drugs? You have written a whole wonderful book, Generic, The Unbranding of Modern Medicine. So presumably you can tell us what is a generic drug?
It's a surprisingly hard question to answer, Terry, because what a generic drug is has actually changed over time. As a historian of science and medicine, I find myself drawn to questions like this when we have an object that seems like a stable, commonplace object in our lives, like a generic drug. Everyone knows what it is. It is a drug at its most basic form. It's a commodity. It's a molecule. It's supposed to do the work that a biomedical therapeutic does. We believe that our therapeutics today work because we know what the molecular basis of them are and how they act on the human body. And yet, what needs to be the same? What needs to be proved to be the same in order to demonstrate that a generic drug is actually therapeutically equivalent to the brand name version or an innovator version that was originally marketed? Turns out to be a very complex and I would argue a historically emergent question that we are continuing to discover year after year new forms of difference that can emerge in otherwise similar therapeutic objects. So my quick answer is that a generic drug is something that changes quite a bit over time, even though it's supposed to be the same.
That is fascinating. You know, I think everybody is familiar with generic products because you can go into the grocery store and you can buy Dole pineapple and you can go, yes, I love Dole, but you can also get house brand pineapple. And it may be, pretty good. You probably pay less. You don't expect it to be quite as good as the brand name. And the same thing can be said for Kleenex. The same thing could be said for toilet paper. Even the tires on your car. You can buy the brand name. You can get the Michelins, or you can get the, less expensive. But what the Food and Drug Administration says is you don't have to worry about quality. I mean, you might have to spend, in the case of, let's take a beta blocker that you might be familiar with as a physician, Corig. So Corig is a very popular medicine for high blood pressure and for heart problems. $349 for 90 days. Expensive drug. You can go into a big box store and get the generic Carvedilol, same 90 days for $10. The FDA says they're identical. Are they?
Well, what I'd like to answer that question with is saying that they should be, and we should live in a world in which we can treat them as being the same in all ways that matter. At the same time, we know they're not identical, if only for the reason that you just stated. They differ in price. They also differ in qualities like the place of origin, the manufacture of origin, the size, shape, and color of the pill or tablet or capsule consumed. What I mean to say is that we hold these differences to be trivial, and the underlying similarity, the molecule of the drug, its delivery to the body, to be the same. And this is what I would call the science and politics of similarity. We know generic drugs are not identical to brand name drugs. We want to trust the FDA when they tell us that they're the same in all ways that matter. But underlying that question is knowing what ways matter, and that becomes a very difficult question to unpack.
Exactly, and that's what we're going to be talking more about this hour. Do you have a question about generic drugs or a story about your experience? We welcome your calls at 888-472-3366. You can also email us. The address is radio@peoplespharmacy.com, or send us a message by way of Twitter. We're at People's Pharmacy. The number again, 888-472-3366.
We're talking with Dr. Jeremy Greene. He is a physician as well as a historian. He has both an MD and a PhD. His new book, Generic, The Unbranding of Modern Medicine.
Now, Dr. Greene, you've just said that we want generic drugs to be identical in the ways that matter. I'm assuming the ways that matter are how it affects our disease process, because by and large, that's why we're taking a medicine, whether it's brand or generic. What kind of evidence do we have in that regard?
Well, we have a lot of evidence, but that evidence base has changed over time. So, for example, when the generic drug becomes an object of conversation in American health policy in the 1960s, and we could go back through a series of really quite fascinating congressional hearings in which generically named drugs are held up as being equivalent to brand name drugs at 20-fold price reductions, and hearings done by, for example, Tennessee Senator Estes Kefauver in the late 50s, early 60s, by Wisconsin Democrat Gaylord Nelson in the late 60s and early 70s. And there's a fascinating, very, very visible set of debates about the equivalence or non-equivalence of brand name and generic drugs at that point in time. Now, in the early hearings, though, the claims of equivalence are chemical. Gaylord Nelson stands up in 1967 and opens this new set of congressional hearings asking why there are 20-fold price differences of drugs that are basically the same thing when all of these drugs contain the same chemical. And one of the drugs that he is talking about is a blockbuster antibiotic called chloromycetin is the brand name. It's produced by Park Davis. Chloramphenicol is its generic name. And by 1967, early generic competition for chloramphenicol has come on the scene. In fact, it's quite fascinating to look at this drug because it's an early example of news media paying attention to a drug that's about to go off patent and asking what's going to happen to this large pharmaceutical company once their drug goes off patent and it faces generic competition. One thing that happens, though, is that it turns out that not all of the generic versions perform the same. One of these differences is picked up by a tropical fish fancier who used to dump a capsule of this antibiotic into fish tanks to prevent diseases in his fish. And when he bought a generic version, realized that rather than dissolving, it floated on the top like it created a white scum on the top of the fish tank. And this led to complaint to Park Davis, to further testing at the FDA on human volunteers. And one of the things they found is that, yes, the capsules had exactly the same amount of the chemical, but they had the same amount of the chemical when they exited the human body as well. So that one of these generic versions, their capsules were chemically equivalent, but they weren't biologically equivalent because they passed through the entire human body without being absorbed at all. And I'm offering this as one illustration of how there now is a testing apparatus for biological equivalence to make sure that generic drugs are absorbed into the bloodstream at the same rate that the original brand name versions are. But that new science was not part of the older set of proof of chemical equivalence. So as we learn of certain problems, of differences we hadn't attended to before, they add to the regulatory apparatus of what the FDA demands as proof of similarity.
Well, we discovered, sort of almost by accident, that a modern drug, Wellbutrin XL300, the brand name from a company called GSK, did not perform exactly the same way as a generic called Budeprion XL300. We'll talk about that a little later in the next segment. But the whole point behind generic drugs, Dr. Greene, is to save money. And we've been told $200 billion are saved on generic drugs. And yet, recently, we have seen generic drugs skyrocket. For example, a drug called Captopril went up 2,800% from a penny, just basically 1.5 cents a pill, to 39, almost 40 cents a pill. Doxycycline up 5,000%. Why such a dramatic increase in generic drug prices?
I'm glad you're bringing this up. This is an incredibly important question today. And Congressman Elijah Cummings and Senator Bernie Sanders have recently opened some congressional hearings into this question. I'm hoping they will lead to more information. The short answer to your question is that we don't know why these generic shortages and spikes in prices are happening. We really need more information. It's a very gray area of the health sector, and much like the congressional hearings I was speaking of before that shed a lot of light into the similarities and differences between generic and brand name drugs in the 60s and 70s, I think that only something that can bring into the public the intersection of many different industries in the generic sector now will actually bring this information to the general public. What I would suggest, though, as a way of approaching this problem is that the current spike in generic drug shortages and generic drug prices, which has very much been affecting my practice in a community health center in East Baltimore and that of physicians, patients, and pharmacists around the country today, it demonstrates a set of flawed assumptions in how we understand generic drug policy to help benefit the American consumer. On the one hand, we assume that we've created sort of a natural system in the life cycle of a drug. There's a first part of a new pharmaceutical's life when it's protected under patent and it's available only as a patent monopoly at a very high price. And then a little bit later, that goes off patent and it becomes generically available. But what we're learning is that there's a third phase in which generic drugs are just old and neglected and can become abandoned.
We do need to take a short break, but when we come back, we'll talk more with Dr. Greene about generic drugs, and we'd like to hear your experience. How have generic drugs worked for you? Give us a call. 888-472-3366 is the number. You can also reach us at radio@peoplespharmacy.com.
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
If you like this podcast of The People's Pharmacy and want to continue the conversation, you can join us online at facebook.com/People's Pharmacy to share your thoughts or comments.
Welcome back to The People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is made possible by Redix Industries, makers of utterly smooth creams and lotions that moisturize deeply to make dry skin feel soft and smooth. The number's 800-345-7339, online at uttercream.com.
And by Squatty Potty Toilet Step Stools, creating healthy toilet posture for fast, easy elimination. More information about how toilet posture affects your health at squattypotty.com.
If you'd like to order a CD of this show, you can call 800-732-2334 or visit our website. It's peoplespharmacy.com.
Today, we're talking about generic medications. How similar do they need to be to their brand name counterparts, and how do we define that? We're interested in your experience, both good and bad. Give us a call at 888-472-3366 or send us an email, radio@peoplespharmacy.com. You can also reach us by way of Twitter. We're at People's Pharmacy.
Our guest is Dr. Jeremy Greene. He's Associate Professor of Medicine and the History of Medicine at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. His most recent book, Generic, The Unbranding of Modern Medicine. We welcome your calls, your questions, and your stories at 888-472-3366. You can also reach us via Twitter at People's Pharmacy or by email, radio@peoplespharmacy.com.
Dr. Greene, as we entered the break, we had to abridge your comments. So you said there was a third phase, and I want to offer you the opportunity to just finish your thought about that.
Sure. We historians can have long answers sometimes, so I'll keep this one briefer. But I think that we have a sense of a natural life cycle of a drug, that it moves from this patent phase where it's available only at a high price, which is seen to be necessary to recoup the investments for research and development, to this post-patent phase where all of these competitors come in and we trust the laws of the market, the invisible hand, to drive the prices down. And this is how generic drug policy balances innovation and access. And we assume that this will work. It's really a free market solution to the problem of balancing innovation and access in prescription drug policy. But what I think we've begun to realize in the last 5 to 10 years is that these drugs start off as new, they could become newly old, and when they're newly old, they're very attractive to generic competition. But after a certain point, drugs can just become old, or old drugs. And these old drugs, which are still war horses or staples of a physician's armamentarium in battling disease, can be less and less attractive and can fall into fewer generic drug houses and then hit a point where only one company might be making it, in which case it's a monopoly again, or can be vulnerable to shortage. And that's what's been happening lately.
Well, I find that especially interesting with regard to a drug called Lanoxin. It's known as digoxin. It comes from the digitalis plant. It was first sold in the UK in 1939, so that makes it a really old drug.
Yeah.
In 1985, you could buy 100 brand-name Lanoxin pills for $3. By 1995, that same amount, 100 pills, cost $8.59. In 2004, it jumped up to, get ready, $24.69. Still a bargain, right?
That was 10 years ago.
Right.
What does it cost now?
Generic digoxin now costs $113.12 for 90 pills. So the generic is way more expensive than, well, I think it has any right to be.
Than the old brand name was 10 years ago, right?
Yeah.
Well, let's go to the phones. It's 888-472-3366. We go to Charlotte, North Carolina. Kaylin, welcome to the People's Pharmacy.
Hi, Joe and Terry.
Hello, Kaylin. What's your story?
In 1989, I was prescribed with Xanax, the name brand drug. Then after a while, my doctor switched me to a generic, and I found that it wasn't working nearly as well. And my doctor said to me, there's a difference in generics from one and the other. He said, I'd like to start you on the Greenstone generic. And it worked as well as the first drug I tried. But I just wanted to say there's a difference not only between generic and name brand, but between generics.
Kaylin, that's such an important point. Thanks so much. Dr. Greene, would you elaborate, please?
No, thanks for bringing that up. And there's so many interesting things about your story to talk about. And on the one hand, I'm sorry that you went through that. I'm glad you found a solution. One of the first things I'd bring up is you're labeling this concept. It seems really oxymoronic at first. that there is such a thing as a branding of generics, that your physician could recognize that a certain brand of generics, Greenstone generics, in his experience, actually worked better than the just generalized field of commodity generics, which suggests there's these different tiers that we operate when we talk about sameness and difference. We can talk about the brand, we can talk about brands of generics, and then we can talk about the general field altogether. There's also different levels of knowledge about whether something works or not, and the FDA works on regulating at a population level. So you seeing that this drug is not working for you on an individual level can sometimes conflict with the FDA's population-based knowledge. Your physician's knowledge is somewhere in between. I'm assuming that his or her answer to your question was based on experience with other patients that had had similar problems. And so is seeing a bunch of different individual cases that forms practical experience that is not visible to you or to the FDA. And I think a lot of the questions about what to do when generic drugs don't work teeter at these different levels of what kind of experience and knowledge counts.
What's so interesting to me, Dr. Greene, is that sometimes it's hard for people to really know, in quotes, whether the generic is working as well as the brand name. But a drug like Xanax, alprazolam, this is a benzodiazepine. It's a short-acting drug. And when you don't take it, or if it doesn't work as well, you go into a kind of withdrawal. You feel terrible. It's not only that it's not working to relieve your anxiety, which is the purpose of the drug, but you may actually experience this withdrawal phenomenon. And we've heard from other people that when they have switched to a generic that they can get into that problem. There's the other issue, and that's what's called the authorized generic, which I believe Greenstone sometimes is involved with, where they're actually made by the same company as the brand name on the same production line. So it becomes very complicated. What is a generic?
It's a very good point. And the question of authorized generics is still mystifying to many of us. An authorized generic is a product that is ushered into the market using the original regulatory pathway of the brand name drug or the new drug application that the original patent holder used. They license out their ability to use it. And so when you buy an authorized generic, you're consuming some sort of extra guarantee that this product is approved on some level by the original manufacturer. When you buy an unauthorized generic, although that's not a term anyone uses, when you buy a commodity generic, you're buying something that was approved under an approved new drug application, an ANDA pathway. Not to get too much into the regulatory jargon, but this is the proof of similarity the FDA demands from generic competitors. They have to show that their drug is present in the bloodstream, for example, and bioequivalent and otherwise meets good manufacturing practices. So you have these different ways of regulating generic drugs. One of the questions that emerges, though, is what are consumers buying if they spend more money on an authorized generic? Are they actually consuming a safer or more effective drug? The FDA would say no. Are they consuming some sort of extra guarantee on a reputational basis from a company? That's what it seems to be. In which case, it's hard to know, is that worth the extra money that might be paid for such a product, or is it merely an extra extension of this mystification of the value of a trademark after a patent has expired?
It is complicated, but let's go right back to the phones, 888-472-3366.
Jeff in Dallas, Texas, welcome to the People's Pharmacy. Your comment?
Well, hi, Joe and Terry. I just learned something when you were talking about authorized generics. I called in initially to say that when you're talking about house brand foods, that many times the house brand food is in fact manufactured by the name brand manufacturer on the same factory and then just labeled for the store that's selling it. And so it ends up being the same thing on the same assembly line. Now, the thing about it is, and here's where the question comes in now, knowing about authorized, is you have no way of knowing when you buy the house brand food whether that house brand food is actually manufactured by Dole or Libby or whatever, or whether it's just manufactured by a third party. So my question, I guess, now is, now that I know that there are authorized generics, how would I know which is the authorized generic if I wanted to ask for it?
Great question. Jeff, I don't know that we have a good answer because it's not easy to get that information. We've been trying to get it for the last 2 or 3 years. The FDA is not completely transparent when it comes to this issue. Dr. Greene, any insight?
So the short answer is, yeah, it's very difficult to tell as an end consumer. One way to tell, though, and this is one of the early means by which authorized generics sought to market themselves as different, is that some authorized generics, because they essentially pay for the license to use the brand name, to use the original regulatory pathway of the brand name drug, they also pay for the right to use the same size, shape, color, and appearance. And so sometimes an authorized generic will actually look the same as a brand name drug, with the exception of not having the brand name on it. And I want to expand on this for a second because it points at an element of pharmaceutical trademarks that I don't think enough attention has been paid to, which is that the physical parameters of a pill or capsule are covered by trademark law. They're defensible in perpetuity. So the purple pill is purple long after Prilosec or then Nexium goes off patent. Viagra remains a blue diamond, and subsequent generic forms of sildenafil will not be able to package it exactly the same. So there's a question that's emerging, and it's becoming increasingly of interest to the FDA, whether the likely placebo effects of knowing that your pill looks the same might actually have some influence on ultimately people's therapeutic experience, whether they believe the drug works for them or whether they're able to remain adherent to their medicines. Which is to say, we currently think that a thing like the size, shape, or color is not a part of how a drug works, which is why it's a trademark and why it's saleable. And a private property, a brand name company can license to an authorized version but not allow a generic version to use.
What we learned, by the way, Dr. Greene, and it came as a real shock to us, with regard to that antidepressant we mentioned a little earlier, Wellbutrin XL300, the release mechanism, the formulation, the way in which the drug releases its its active ingredient into the bloodstream is also under patent. And so GSK had what they called a membrane technology, a very small pill.
But that patent is separate from the one for the pharmaceutical.
Right. And the generic manufacturer, Teva, using the product Budeprion XL300, used a matrix formulation, and it released the active ingredient quite differently and ultimately led to the withdrawal of that generic drug.
So I think that's a great example of how when we make all of these assumptions when we think about a drug, and they're very wishful and idealized assumptions about what we want to believe about biomedicine. We want to believe that we know the molecule works and the molecule does the job and the molecule is the drug. But as we've learned in many different examples over the past 50 years, a drug is not a molecule. A drug is a complex technology for releasing that, for getting that molecule to its target site of function in the body. And there's many different components and steps that can have an influence, from the shellac on the surface of a pill to dispersants, binders, gels. All of these things which we want to treat as trivial could be significant. And sometimes, as in the case that you're mentioning, there is a deliberate means of withholding key pieces of information as to how a drug works under either a separate patent or trade secret so that subsequent versions cannot actually be therapeutically identical.
Dr. Greene, we have a call from Dennis in Siler City, North Carolina. Dennis, welcome to the People's Pharmacy. Your story.
Hello, Joe and Terry. I had a heart attack back in 2001, and some of the medications I was put on were life-saving. One of them we were speaking of earlier was Coreg, Diovan, and particularly warfarin to prevent any further blood clots. And they had to monitor my INR, and I had some excellent results on the Coumadin. When I switched over to the VA, they, of course, put me on the generic equivalents. And one of the things I noticed is when I went from Coumadin to warfarin, it was much more difficult to control my INR. I would have bleeding times all over the place. So eventually they switched me back to Coumadin, and at that point we got a much better control. I understand chemically they're supposed to be the same, but I definitely had much different results when I was on the generic equivalent.
Dennis, thank you so much for the call. You know, we've heard this story over and over again over the last 25 years, I'd be interested in your response, because clearly in the case of a drug like warfarin or the brand name Coumadin, having too much or too little in the bloodstream is a life-threatening situation. Dr. Greene?
No, thanks for bringing that up, and thank you for sharing that story in particular. I think that your story really cuts to the heart of how generic drugs become difficult things to regulate, and that they also become difficult objects to deal with in practice even once regulated. So clearly over the years there have been many concerns about blood thinners. Even before warfarin, a lot of concerns about dicumarol. Other drugs which need to be titrated to a precise level in the bloodstream to be functional, where both too little or too much are dangerous, include thyroid medications, for example, and some anti-epileptic medications. And one of the problems we see looking at how the FDA regulates these drugs over time is that they're consistently responding to these kinds of concerns, and yet only able to come up with regulations based on what they can see in broad populations. And we know that drugs like warfarin, like thyroid medication, interact with so many different parts of the biological system that different people can respond to them very differently. So whereas a general population might see no difference between these versions, you as an individual can. So it leaves you and your physician with a uneasy space to practice in which the reimbursement policy of your insurance company or the VA, as you mentioned, will say, no, we will only pay the generic price. And yet, if it is clearly evident that you as an individual are experiencing a difference that's significant to you, it's really incumbent on your physician to advocate for you. And there are pathways to get you back on the original version. But it places the physician in an uneasy place of using their own reason as a physician and advocate against the rationality of the FDA's regulatory structure.
Dr. Greene, we've got an email from Georgie. She says, my 7-year-old child had not had a seizure in 4 years. The epilepsy was well controlled by Keppra and a ketogenic diet. She is now receiving the generic form of Keppra, and the seizures have returned. Is there any way to get the pharmacy to give me brand name Keppra? And I'm afraid we don't have much time.
Yes, we're going to ask you to think about that question and answer it when we come back from this break. When we come back, we'll also talk about how and why generic drug manufacturing has shifted overseas. We've been told by the FDA that now 80% of the active pharmaceutical ingredients are made abroad. And we'll take more of your calls and questions about generic drugs at 888-472-3366. If our lines are busy, you can email us, radio@peoplespharmacy.com, or via Twitter @peoplespharmacy.
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon. If you're enjoying this People's Pharmacy podcast, why not head over to our website where you'll find a wealth of information on medications, conditions, home remedies, and ways to keep yourself healthy. You'll find it all at peoplespharmacy.com. Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Redix Industries, makers of utterly smooth creams and lotions, helping dry, cracked skin feel utterly soft and smooth. The number's 800-345-7339, online at uttercream.com.
And by Squatty Potty Toilet Step Stools, creating healthy toilet posture for fast, easy elimination. More information about how toilet posture affects your health at squattypotty.com.
You can purchase a CD of this show by calling 800-732-2334. Today's show is number 973, or you can find it on the web at peoplespharmacy.com.
Today we're talking about generic drugs. They're supposed to be interchangeable with their brand name counterparts for therapeutic purposes. But some questions have been raised about whether that's always the case.
We're talking with Dr. Jeremy Greene. He's Associate Professor of Medicine and the History of Medicine, and the Elizabeth Trida and the A. McGee Harvey Chair in the History of Medicine at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. He's author of Generic, The Unbranding of Modern Medicine. And you were saying one thing that's, I think, very important for our listeners right now, Dr. Greene, and that is that a physician can advocate for a patient who's not getting well served by a particular generic. It is possible to go up against the insurance companies?
Oh, it certainly is, and thanks. I wanted to have a chance to address the concerns of the last caller who told a story, which is unfortunately very, very common, of a daughter or a family member who is on epilepsy, whose seizures are controlled on one version of medication, switches to another, and sees a return of seizures. And this is the question of generic equivalence and what kinds of laws and what kind of insurance structure should mandate substitution becomes to a particular visible and really poignant head in the case of epilepsy, partly because unlike, say, the case of high blood pressure, if your blood pressure becomes a little bit less controlled over a few weeks, working to titrate it back down is not such a big deal. But a breakthrough seizure is a devastating event in a person living with epilepsy who's been under control. It has social, economic, and vital consequences. So there's a set of problems that happen here, and neurologists and epidemiologists have been looking at it for a while. On a populational level, the FDA looks at this data and basically can't find differences. On an individual level, we keep on seeing differences pop up. And this is where I do think that the individual physician has a role and a responsibility to act as an advocate. What's interesting to see here is how the terms of this debate have changed since the 1960s. In the 1960s, it was very clear that physicians could ultimately control whatever formulation of drug their patients received, and were very resistant to any structure that might substitute. So generic drug substitution was illegal at the pharmacy in most states. What we've seen over the past 50 years has been the development of a set of generic substitution laws that in many states mandate generic substitution, and a set of incentive structures built into insurance companies which make it much cheaper and much easier to prescribe generically. And this is partly why we've seen this shift in generic utilization from less than 10% in 1960 to more than 84% of all prescriptions in 2014. What I'd like to suggest, though, is that as that bureaucratic structure has built over time, it has produced significant cost savings for the American public, and yet it has always left a pathway open for physicians to prescribe what they deem necessary for their patients and see it filled. So I would say one can take this information always to one's physician and demand they act as an advocate. One of the things that has happened, though, is that the bits of paperwork, the drudgery, the phone calls, and the forms that need to be filled out to make this happen have grown over time. And so you really need a strong case, and you need a strong advocate in your physician.
And I think for a long time, people believed that the FDA absolutely had its act together. So when we heard from patients who said that Budeprion XL300 was not working as well as the brand name Wellbutrin, a lot of pharmacists and a lot of physicians said, no, that's all psychological. It's all in your head, dear. And then when the FDA did a reversal, it came as a big shock, I think, to a lot of health professionals.
And of course, we know that there are psychological impacts of various things, like what color is it, what shape is it, and that sort of thing. There have actually been studies on that.
So I think both of these levels that you're illustrating a very important problem here, which is that when an individual finds that their experience doesn't conform to the regulatory knowledge of equivalence, these are two possible pathways of explaining it. It could be a placebo effect. Or it could be some real difference that we haven't attended to yet and need to learn how to attend to. Or it could be a difference that is important but is only visible on such a small level that populational studies can never take it, can never make it visible. Again, I think we speak aspirationally of what we want the FDA to be able to do. The FDA is really quite understaffed in its ability to maintain inspections all over the world where it needs to work. I'd say I keep coming back to the statement of a consumer advocate back in 1960 in some of the original hearings into generic drugs led by Estes Kefauver. This is Mildred Brady from Consumers Union, who made a statement at the hearing that the current structure of regulating generic drugs is not in place, so that we can't trust that all drugs are the same yet. But she says this, and I'll give a quick quote: "By whatever means proved to be necessary, and in the shortest possible time, the federal government must create within the drug industry those circumstances under which any physician in the United States may prescribe with full confidence in its potency, effectiveness, and freedom from adulteration any drug regardless of its price or its name, generic or otherwise, which he feels will most benefit his patient." And that was a very important statement in 1960 of stating what the generic marketplace should look like. We're a lot closer to that belief now than we were in 1960, but we keep on being reminded there are problems that continuously emerge.
We go to Bayonet Point, Florida. Eileen, welcome to the People's Pharmacy. Tell us your experience, please.
Hello, Joe and Terry. I am a registered nurse, been one for nearly 40 years, so my perspective is a little bit different. And I know that in my state, I'm not sure about other states, I've read other articles, but in my state, by state law, a generic only has to be 80% effective 80% of the time, which means that you really don't know what you're getting when you're getting your generic medication. And also an article I was reading recently, you lose legal rights when you use a generic. Case that went to court was over the trade name Phenergan, and a generic had been given in the ER, and the patient had a devastating reaction to it. And when she went to sue not just the hospital and everybody else, but the drug manufacturer, the courts determined that because the information in the medication that comes with the medication for healthcare providers is not the property and produced by the generic manufacturer, but is only a copy of what the original manufacturer produced, that they were not legally responsible for it, and her case was thrown out. She lost her legal rights because she was using a generic, which of course she had no knowledge that she was using or had any ability to say, no, I want the generic, I want the trade name drug. It's something that patients, consumers, don't quite understand what they're losing when they choose or are forced to use generics.
Dr. Greene, I'd be interested in your response.
I'm glad you bring up this question. As to apologies, I clearly need some generic medications myself today. As to the 80% question, I'd love to actually let Joe answer that question, because I do think there's some reinterpretation of what that 80% rule actually means statistically. But I'd like to take the point. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, it does turn out to be so complicated that I think very few people really understand it.
You know, I actually asked one of the top people at the Food and Drug Administration to explain bioequivalence and the 80 to 125 rule. And he says, I have a hard time explaining this to my colleagues here at the Food and Drug Administration. Most people don't have a clue.
It has to do with confidence intervals. So people have to actually have at least some understanding of statistics to know what the confidence interval is.
But we won't get too far into the weeds about that. But your thoughts with regard to this liability issue?
Sure, and I have to say this is part of the pleasure of being interviewed by a pharmacologist and an anthropologist, is that I thought I could defer some of the questions to you. I don't think it quite means 80% effective 80% of the time, and I just wanted to highlight
right.
that.
No, it really does. Yeah. It really does not mean that. And as I said, what it does mean is very complicated, and as Joe pointed out, it's really hard to explain, even within the FDA.
But I think this illustrates some of the problems consumers have with generic drugs, is that a phrase like that winds up having resonance. Now, the liability concern is a very serious concern, and I think the caller really got that on, hit that on the head. The ruling that she's speaking of is Pleva versus Mensing, in which it was determined that that although a prior consumer had been able to sue for damages caused by an adverse of a brand name version of that drug, that damages and adverse effects suffered by a generic version was not the responsibility of the generic drug company. And really what this case has since, I would say, been updated by an even more baffling case that took place it was ruled in Alabama just this past fall, which ruled that someone who had experienced similar damages who did not sue the generic drug company but sued the brand name company that made the original drug. So Pfizer was actually ordered by the Supreme Court of the state of Alabama to pay damages to a patient that was injured consuming a generic version of a drug that Pfizer had originally produced. So Pfizer had to pay damages done to a person for a drug they did not even produce. And this is really the completion of a trilogy of cases which show that courts don't hold generic drug companies liable for damages. And the reasoning goes something like this. Generic drug companies don't claim to produce knowledge about whether a drug works or not, or is safe or not. They don't produce the labeling, which is that part of a drug's claims that the FDA really precisely adjudicates. All they claim is to produce the same thing. And if the drug was the same thing, if it met criteria of equivalence, the generic drug manufacturer has fully exercised all of its responsibilities. And it seems quite bizarre at first to look at these cases, and yet these cases on generic liability highlight the fact that we don't demand generic drug companies to actually produce knowledge about drugs and how they work, just knowledge about similarity.
It's a little like Alice in Wonderland. We do have just a few moments left, and we'll take your calls and questions at 888-472-3366. I do want to talk about how most generic drugs these days are made abroad. And why is that? And in particular, the oversight of foreign manufacturing by the FDA. Bloomberg News had an expose just a couple of weeks ago in which it looked at one of the largest manufacturers in India, Sun Pharmaceuticals, and they've just bought Ranbaxy, so this is going to be like the number one generic drug company in India. And what they found is that the company actually deleted results that didn't conform to what they wanted.
Well, in fact, Joe, we have an email from Jim in Winchester, Virginia. He says, how about an update on fake equivalency or deletion of results by Indian pharmaceutical companies, and do Chinese companies do this too?
Well, it turns out there are, as far as we can tell, only 2 FDA investigators in China. There are a dozen in India. And the FDA, in one of the documents that was uncovered by Bloomberg, said a review of FDA documents by Bloomberg News found that similar actions on quality tests have happened at dozens of other companies' plants across India that make drug ingredients and pills for export to the U.S. So what about this whole issue of monitoring and oversight of foreign manufacture of active pharmaceutical ingredients?
Well, it's really quite concerning. There's a couple of things I'd like to say to this. First of all, the problems of global production of pharmaceuticals are not limited to generic drugs. If we buy a pill from Pfizer, it's hard to know at which point of its many factories in many parts of the world that pill actually comes from, let alone how many steps went into its manufacturing from an active pharmaceutical ingredient all the way to the finished product. The FDA released a report a few years ago suggesting that the average pharmaceutical, and I would say this API, the active pharmaceutical ingredient, oftentimes another company will make the chemical that gets put into the pill. If you look back into the 60s, the early generic drug companies, these small mom-and-pop companies, are oftentimes buying their chemicals from companies in Europe that don't observe patents in the same way. Bolar, which is one of the first companies I wound up looking at, was a company in Brooklyn that would basically buy a drum of chemicals from Italy. It would get shipped. They would take that chemical, measure it, stuff it into pills, and produce it. And they're not manufacturing their own generic drug. And you can see there's a translation of one step, right, from one place to another. The FDA, in a report just a few years ago, suggested that pharmaceutical production has become so globalized that the average pill a consumer in America takes has passed through 81 different places in its production, from the ultimate raw materials to the pill they consume. And if you think of just how much more challenging it is to regulate the quality of production at all of those steps, for a brand name pill as well as generic pill, the FDA is really increasingly leveraged, and they're working very hard to figure out what to do, but they have relatively small resources with which to actually inspect and guarantee quality at all levels.
Dr. Greene, we have sometimes been asked by people, why can't we know the country of origin of our medication? You know, it's on your plum when you buy it in the supermarket. It's on your T-shirt when you buy it at the store. but it's not on the drug that you buy in the pharmacy. It sounds as though you wouldn't be able to fit all of those different countries of origin into the label of a drug.
It's true. You would need a much bigger label, or you need to make a larger bottle just to be able to hold the label that would hold all of that information. It really is a statement of the globalized nature of pharmaceutical production today. And again, I wouldn't limit it to generic drugs, although particularly in the case of Ranbaxy & Son, as you're mentioning, I mean, Ranbaxy just earlier this year was under scrutiny for bits of ground glass found in its generic version of atorvastatin or Lipitor. When the cases come to light, they're dramatic and they receive a lot of attention, and yet they don't necessarily result in more support for the FDA actually being able to have more officers in these countries in a way that would really be required.
Dr. Greene, we are just about out of time. Perhaps you can help our listeners understand the message behind generic, the unbranding of modern medicine, and how they can use generic drugs safely and wisely.
Sure. So the point of the book is not an expose of the industry. I mean, as a physician, as a father, as a patient myself, I use generic drugs any given week in the clinic. I want to believe they're the same, and I think there are a lot of people working hard to make sure that the science of similarity works such that differences are trivial, similarities are meaningful, and the cost savings are real and valuable. I think a historical perspective on generics, however, forces us to recognize that our knowledge is contingent, it's limited, it's emergent. We only learn what matters in medicines by finding out examples in which things we thought were the same, differences we thought were trivial, turn out to become significant. So I'd say the broadest message of the book is that the generic, far from being a mundane item, is actually a window into problems of how we get value out of modern biomedicine at a reasonable price, which is a goal that's, I think, quite noble and quite important for the future of our healthcare system.
Dr. Greene, thank you so much for joining us today on the People's Pharmacy. That's all the time we have, and thank you to our listeners for joining us today.
Dr. Jeremy Greene is Associate Professor of Medicine and the History of Medicine, and the Elizabeth Trida and A. McGee Harvey Chair in the History of Medicine at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. His book is Generic, The Unbranding of Modern Medicine. There are links to his websites from ours.
Lynn Siegel produced today's show. Sophie Copeland provided technical assistance. Al Wodarski is the engineer. Dave Graydon edits our interviews.
The People's Pharmacy is produced at the studios of North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC.
The People's Pharmacy theme music by B.J. Liederman.
If you'd like to order a copy of today's show, it's 800-732-2334. Its number is 973. That number again, 800-732-2334, or find it online at peoplespharmacy.com.
In Durham, North Carolina, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Thank you for listening, and please join us again next week.
We hope you enjoyed this podcast. If so, please consider taking a minute to write a review on iTunes. And thanks for listening to The People's Pharmacy.